Hello, welcome to this emergency farm gate. I'm Costain, editor of 8.9.com. Reports indicate that funding for nature-friendly farming in England is due to be slashed in the UK spending review taking place next week on the 11th of June. What's likely to happen? What does it mean? And what can farmers do about it? I'm joined by Martin Lines, Chief Executive of the Nature-Friendly Farming Network, and by Julia Aglionby, Executive Director of the Foundation for Common Land and Professor of Practice at University of Cumbria, and by Joe Stanley, farming commentator, Wheat from the Chaff co-host and Head of Sustainable Farming at the GWCT Allerton project. Welcome everyone. Martin, is nature-friendly farming under attack?
I think under attack, I'm not sure, but certainly all the support that helps it work is being squeezed and adding such uncertainty to what we're trying to do. We can run our businesses that have nature, as a focus, but to deliver the additionality and to really deliver nature restoration and recovery, that needs to be funded and supported. And if they're going to squeeze that, which the language and the tone seems to be, nature is going to lose out.
So what are we actually expecting from the spending review?
Well, we know the spending review is about setting out the government's budget for this parliament and its priorities. We know DEFRA is an unprotected sector. We know there's a lot of focus on the defence and NHS. So if they're going to find savings within their budget to offer increases elsewhere, the concern is the DEFRA budget gets squeezed. But we also not clear whether that's the DEFRA delivery budget or their overall operational budget. And many of us are trying to protect that delivery budget to help farmers deliver for nature and for food production.
Do you get a sense, Martin, of how that rebalancing is going to take shape? Who's going to suffer most?
So in DEFRA, we know the SFI hasn't been delivered fairly. It hasn't reached the uplands, less productive landscapes, the grassed areas as much as it has the cereal sectors. And some farmers have been more proactive in getting agreements signed and over the line compared with others. So we know they're looking to move more support in smaller farms and farms that haven't traditionally been able to get access to those schemes. So what that means will be probably less for arable and more for sort of upland or less productive areas in food production, but maybe productive for the environment.
Joe, this report first came out from The Guardian. Helena Horton reported this. How likely is it that Guardian reporting is correct? And if it is, what are the government playing at?
Well, you've always got to take, obviously, sort of media reports with a pinch of salt, Finlo, both between kind of the individual, I guess, proclivities of individual journalists, but then also, of course, their understanding of what can often be a very nuanced and wide-ranging policy issue. One of my sort of pet peeves really around our sort of national conversation around food farming and the environment is that frankly the quality doesn't seem to have improved very much in the last 6 or 8 years, despite the huge reams of print which have been dedicated to the topic. However, Helena Horton at The Guardian does seem to have a sort of favoured status, I think, within DEFRA. She's been breaking a lot of these sorts of stories in recent months. And if you talk to people who are close to this whole kind of side of policy development, you're not hearing that DEFRA is strongly denying that at least the broad sweep of what's being reported is accurate, i.e. that we are looking at a fundamental shift in what essentially the deal has been with British agriculture since we left the European Union, that there would be public money delivered for public goods, that farmers across the country, as many as could possibly be brought on board, would be paid to deliver benefits for the environment. And of course, the irony is that for the last 6 to 8 years, farmers have been concerned that food hasn't had a significant enough position within that new public money for public goods structure. And now, almost seemingly overnight, the danger is now that nature has been thrown out as well.
So I'll go back to that second part of the question, Joe. So what are the government playing at?
I mean, as Martin said, look, we're in incredibly tightened budget circumstances. That peace dividend that we got at the end of the Cold War has been well and truly spent, right? We're having to pour significant amounts back into defence, into the NHS, into education, into all these departments, which frankly, we all know, we can all feel it in society, across the public sector, everything is getting worse. Everything needs more money, more investment. And we always knew that this was the inevitable end game once essentially, environmental and agricultural spending came away from Brussels and those protected long-term budgets and back towards, Westminster. I think anyone who thought that when it came back to Westminster, the decision making would get better or more long-term was kidding themselves. And unfortunately, that is what we are now seeing. We're essentially seeing the playing out of those worst fears being realized, that, as Martin said, the DEFRA budget is unprotected and we are up against some absolutely voracious elements of public spending, which, DEFRA is never going to get a shout in. And just one final thing on that, of course, what the polling indicates to the politicians is that, at least in the way they currently frame the questions, spending on this sort of thing, on the environment, on, farming, is not considered a priority by voters. And that is, I guess, the safety net that our politicians are now falling back on. That these are not things that they need to prioritize, regardless of whether they're important. I mean, we can talk as much as we want about defense and bombs, bullets and boats. Ultimately, as we've learned through history, on the food security angle, we have to think about food security just as much as we think about national security in its kind of more pointy sense. But yeah, the nature thing, look, I mean, if anyone, again, thinks that we don't need to focus on nature recovery and climate change and that is something that we can just deprioritize, again, I mean, we're heading for disaster. That way does not lie a happy future.
As you say, Joe, security is security, whether it's in terms of bullets and bombs and boats, or whether it's in terms of food security or ecological security. It should all be considered part of the same. Julia, you're an upland farmer and you work with upland farmers. If money's being redirected from arable to the uplands, are you pleased about that?
Well, upland farmers do need to be properly supported, but it shouldn't be an either or, uplands or lowlands. What we've seen since the phase out of BPS is that the majority of upland farmers are trapped in higher level stewardship agreements. And that means they've not been able to stack SFI on top of their existing agreements, which is why we've seen such a low take up. So I would say that what we really need to look at is the total budget that's going into agriculture and the environment. It's currently government expenditure is about 1.2 trillion per year, and we're looking at a UK budget for farming of about 2.5 billion. So that's 0.2% of government expenditure. I just do not buy this argument about defence, health and education. These are political choices, and we know that the government is making political choices. It will make no difference to defence and education and health, the amount of money we're talking about. It will make a huge difference as to whether we're going to be able to deliver food security, ecological resilience, and upland communities, and also our landscape. This is the place where English people, British people receive their spiritual refreshment. We have 18, here I am in Ambleside looking out at the Lake District, and we have 18 million people a year, the majority who are British, who come on holiday here each year. This is a really good investment. The government is making a political choice not to invest in our landscapes, not to invest in our food, and not to invest in our ecology.
And Julia, I think on that same note, it's worth just reminding people of the statistic. This is a few years old now, so it's likely to have changed a very small amount. But if farmers were getting 3 billion to administer the land in the way that you were just talking about, then just the cost of administering central government is 11 billion. So nearly 4 times more than farmers are getting to manage 70% of these islands. Just talk me through the public funding farm support situation at the moment, would you, Julia? Where are the bulk of farmers getting public funding from?
Well, in terms of public funding, where most upland farmers are getting it from higher level stewardship. If we look at the figures that came out from the 1st of April, and we're looking at this is not just upland farmers. If we look across where businesses are, there are about 85,000 commercial farm businesses. About 58% of those are now in some sort of scheme. So that's about just under 50,000. This is the latest data from DEFRA. And we know that about 32,000 businesses have taken up SFI agreements. But again, that could just be people putting some hedges in. It's very variable, the amount that people are putting in. In terms of the uplands, where we know that public support still makes up about 63% of a farm's income. The majority of farmers are still in higher level stewardship agreements, and there are 27,000 farm businesses across lowlands and uplands who are in the old countryside stewardship agreements. So here we have 32,000 farms in the old agreements, and they all need to transition into the new agreements in the next 3 to 4 years. And one of my big concerns is the mechanism for transferring people across. The majority of these agreements will end by 2028, and we're currently seeing, when we've got the halting of the SFI, and a big concern of when that will open again, particularly as there's a new computer system being developed. A new rural payments portal is being developed for the new SFI 2026. Will it be ready in time is the big question. And then also, in terms of the new countryside stewardship hire tier, which has some really super options in it, a lot of effort's been put into that, but access to that is being managed through a pipeline, and we're probably only going to see about between 1,000 and 1,500 agreements per year. So if there are 32,000 agreements to transfer, what we're going to see is it's going to take over 20 years to transfer people across from one scheme to another, unless there's a very significant change in uptake, in delivery.
Now, we're talking about the UK's spending review, but really it's farmers in England that we're talking about, isn't it, that are going to be affected by these Treasury choices. Will farmers in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland be affected at all?
No, their budgets are ring-fenced. So if we look at government expenditure, so if we looked at the spring statement, it's quite interesting. I did some analysis looking at this over the weekend, and agriculture and the environment are devolved matters. And so those budgets are completely separate, and the Scottish, Welsh and Northern Irish governments have control over how they spend their money. And we know we don't have a level playing field. Say you're selling your stock at Carlisle, near where I work for a long time, at the auction mart there. Farmers are coming from across the board from Scotland. It's not a level playing field. They're still receiving BPS. Here in England, where no farm is receiving more than £7,200 this year. I know at home we're only receiving about £3,000 this year. It just isn't a level playing field. And it's great that there's continuity for the Welsh, Scottish and Northern Irish, and they're making a more phased approach to this. But it's very, very tough for the 85,000 English farmers.
Martin, does everyone need to move to Scotland? What is the immediate impact likely to be?
Well, if they go with big cuts, we could see England farmers having very little public funding support, where the rest of the devolved nations are, and set out in the within the EU a sector with very little public funded support in England, and competing with people from across the water and across borders in the UK with different kind of support systems and output priorities set within their governments. Will then the devolved nations see that because England's reduced theirs, they can then reduce the support to farmers? And remember, the whole point of the transition was, paying public money for public goods. So what they're now saying is we do not want those public goods because we can't afford to deliver them. And those public goods were to improve biodiversity, minimise flooding, give access to the landscape for public. There's a whole range of public goods that, as farmers, we were to be encouraged and supported to deliver. So we're going to see a very much different landscape look in different parts of the UK, depending on where the funding's available.
So it's not just farmers that are going to be impacted by these changes, but the general public as well, and anybody who lives near a floodplain.
Yeah, I think the society is going to be affected by this. It's farmers are going to be rewarded or paid to deliver. And it's not a subsidy, it's a paid for an outcome society wanted. So if society doesn't want, or the government doesn't want to help farmers deliver benefits for society to minimise flooding, give access to nature, to bring nature back into landscapes that have been removed through past government policy. This wasn't farmers driving this. It was a farming system and a policy system. So the society is going to lose out. And we know nature underpins the UK economy and the global economy. So if we are going to have changing weather and changing impacts, our UK economy is going to suffer by not investing now in the longer term.
What do you think the immediate impact will be on farmland?
I think many farmers, as they come out of their schemes or have not been in schemes, you've got to look at every part, see where you can get some income. And if I'm not getting rewarded to deliver that flour margin, that birdseed mix, I'm going to look to see what else I can do. As a farmer who cares about nature and the landscape, I can't afford £700-800 a hectare to go and plant the birdseed mix if I'm not making good returns on the other side. And currently, arable farming isn't. So those areas will go back into crop production or into other areas. Yes, I'll have some areas of the farm that are that awkward corner or misshaped or that wet area that we will choose probably not to farm, but it won't be enhanced. It just not to be farmed, as in growing a crop or producing something. We may put the mower over it. So for me, the amount of what I'm able to do, we've got evidence that proves that it's improving biodiversity on our farm. We cannot deliver that. So nature will go backwards. That would really upset me. And I think it'll upset many farmers that we've had 20 plus years trying to get that combination right of some of the biodiversity elements, food production, other elements on the farm that stack opportunities and benefits. And, I sell the grain and the goods and I market the biodiversity and get public support and hopefully private support in joining it together. And that rug's been pulled out from underneath us if they really slash that budget.
Joe, over the last couple of years, I've seen an awful lot of tree planting and hedge planting taking place around me. There's been a big emphasis on nature in the farmed landscape. What do you think the immediate impact will be? Is that going to change if these funding changes go through?
Well, yeah, I mean, you're right. If you drive around or catch a train through the countryside today and you know what you're looking for, it is remarkable to see the scale of the change which has occurred in terms of more nature-friendly farming practices. Those pollen and nectar strips, wild birdseed areas, cover crops through the winter. These more nature-friendly farming methods. And Julia's right. I mean, the uplands have been, hugely neglected, in this whole SFI policy development. But she's also right that it shouldn't become an either or. And of course, what we're going to see is if they do a complete 180, as seems to be the case from this Guardian report, essentially focusing payments on what they consider to be less agriculturally productive land, in the Guardian saying essentially the uplands, those lines on maps that policymakers seem to like so much. If they restrict those payments to smaller farms, as the Guardian article seems to be indicating, and then essentially say, again, to the rest of the industry, right, it's down to you to just become profitable now through core food production. Well, we know where that leads. The inevitable is exactly as Martin said, that farmers will be forced to take those wildlife areas out of production and put them back into food production. Now, food production is, of course, important, and we have to have more food production, I believe, on this island nation. But at the Allerton project and Martin with Nature Friendly Farming, we can demonstrate that you can have food production alongside a thriving natural environment. And this will force farmers to choose. That's the tragedy of this. Just as, and we know the reason that SFI was closed earlier on this year, preemptorily, was because there was too many farmers getting on board the nature-friendly farming bandwagon. All of a sudden, farmers were realizing, for whatever reason, that actually this was the future, and they were getting on that train, and that was a fantastic thing. But the budget runs out. The government refuses to replenish the budget. As Julia said, we're talking about a fraction of 1% of government spending on something as important as A, yes, national food security, but B, what we do with 70% of our land area here in this country. So for me, it's unforgivable that we're talking about, as Julia said, making this false binary argument. Well, you can either have nature and food, or you can have the NHS. And that's just absolutely a false argument. So, what are we going to see? We're going to see, reversals, immediate reversals. And again, we can demonstrate at the Allerton project, you stop doing the stuff that we know that you can do, which has a positive impact on the environment. And very rapidly, you start to see declines in things like farmland birds, insects across your farm. There will be rapid and immediate losses in the gains that, yes, it's taken us 3 decades to get to this point. And of course, the trust in the farming community. Even if the government decides in 6 months' time it reverses course yet again, the trust is now all spent. How on earth do you get farmers back on board this positive direction of travel when they don't trust that the rug won't be pulled under their feet at any point in the future?
Joe, you and I have discussed on Wheat from the Chaff in the past the land use framework, which did appear to be suggesting that the government wanted to push farming and food production into areas that are the most productive and therefore increase the pressure on that land, perhaps in the east of England, while at the same time then delivering its nature restoration ambitions in the uplands and elsewhere. Is that what you think is starting to play out?
It seems to be. If you take all of the disparate tea leaves across government policy, and of course, many of these policies are inherited from the previous government, but yeah, it does seem to be that they're basically trying to say, look, we've got a limited budget here. What are we going to do? We'll focus it on a smaller area of the country, essentially try and take agriculture out of that landscape entirely. And again, I imagine Julia would not be pro the concept of essentially saying, let's rewild the uplands, because that'll be big impact as far as government policymakers are concerned, big impact for, relatively low hit on food production in this country. Let's do that. And then let's let the lowlands essentially go back to the market. And I think this fundamentally relies on a fundamental lack of understanding in how the agricultural economy works, on what profit there is in the food system. And I just think that ultimately this is bad decision making, driven by that lack of comprehension of how our food system works, how nature works, how we can get them both to thrive across the whole of the farmed landscape. And there is just one thing that's worth pointing out as well, that's buried in the Guardian article. It's talking about focusing nature in the uplands and other what they describe as marginal areas. It's also talking about not cultivating lowland peatland soils. They're the two things it mentions. So, again, there's kind of a strange dichotomy there, isn't there, between saying that we must let the most productive farms farm at the full, under the full force of the market, which is difficult enough when we're competing against the cheapest food in the world with some of the highest production costs in this country. But they're also saying, let's then potentially also seek to de-intensify production on those most productive soils that we have in this country. So there just seems to be a fundamental confusion here in policy, which I think anyone who's been involved with SFI development over the last 8 years now will probably recognise.
Julia, let me come to you, because I wanted to we've been talking about the negative impacts of this, and I just wonder, in the short term, do you think that there could be any positive impacts in terms of the uplands? But then beyond that, I wonder if you could just talk about the impacts in the longer term of this policy change.
Well, at the moment, I can't see the positive impacts, because we have supported UK agriculture and hill farming since immediately after the Second World War with the Hill Farming Act. What we see at the moment is that we've got, in terms of the land that that's already in stewardship schemes in the uplands, we have over 41% of uplands are in HLS schemes of the moorland area, and we're not going to get that replaced, that income replacing. And I'm not convinced that the government is actually committed to upping the payments for the uplands sufficiently. So at the Future Countryside Conference a couple of weeks ago, I asked Minister Zeichner whether he would support a just transition for upland farmers, because my analysis shows that by 2027, we expect hill farmers only to be earning 55% of the minimum wage. And we don't ask teachers to work for 55% of the minimum wage. We don't ask nurses to work for 55% of the minimum wage, but we are asking upland farmers to deliver public goods at way below the minimum wage. And he said to me, he didn't make any assurances, he didn't make any commitment to the just transition. He simply said there were lots of other demands on government money, especially defence. And so while the money, the limited pot there may go up the hill a bit, we're not going to see it. I don't think the uplands getting sufficient. For instance, last week we had the increase in payment rates for the HLS that was announced, and we thought that was going to be 25-30% for the uplands. The main bulk of moorland is in what's called restoration of moorland, code called HL10. That went up by 12.9%, so from £40 to £45.16. If we look at that, payment rate was set at 2005. If we used an RPI calculator, it should be £80 a hectare now, and the government has offered a pitiful £5.16 extra when we would have expected an extra £40. For some reason, their logic was that they would pay 34.5% of the difference between HLS payment rates and the current CS payment rates. Why wouldn't you increase HLS payment rates to at least the same as the current CS payment rates? There is no logic in terms of what they're doing. It appears that, it was a very interesting conference at Future Countryside, and we had Michael Gove talking about the need, if you're going to be in a government, a minister of a government department that isn't protected, that you have to act like a guerrilla and you have to be really strong with the Treasury. And Minister Zeichner simply said, I don't want to be a guerrilla. I believe that what we're doing is the right thing, but there are lots of other demands. And at the moment, you have to actually be making a really strong case, because Rachel Reeves has a lot of pressures on it. And unfortunately, we need to make sure that whoever are the ministers in DEFRA are backing the environment, they're backing the needs of society, they're backing the Natural Health Service, they're backing good quality food. In my role as a commissioner of the Food Farming and Countryside Commission, we know that it is not just about farmers, what the farmers are delivering, as Joe says, managing 70% of England. And we can't do that without some public money, because people can't afford to pay more for their food.
Martin, we talked about guerrillas there, about the need for guerrillas. And Joe and I have talked in the past, I think you and I have, about the way in which DEFRA at the moment is very much down the pecking order on the government's priorities. But that as we face the future, as we face the nature crisis and everything that's coming, it really needs to shoot a long way up, to be up there along with health and Home Office and the Foreign Office, etc. So how do you think this fits within the government policy narrative, such as it is on nature, food and farming?
I would say for so long, and as an agriculture industry and for DEFRA, we haven't championed the role of our landscape and the multifunctional and all of what it can deliver. We'll hear a lot about the food production, but what about the flooding? What about the access to nature? What about the benefits of a healthy diet that helps cut the cost to the NHS, getting people out into nature where possible, and help the mental health cost to the nation? We need to value it in a different way. And I just think for many, DEFRA is about the farming and a bit about the environment stuff. And it's all kind of all right, but we never really put it onto a balance sheet of the cost of nature or the value of nature to all businesses across the country, not just farm businesses. When you get a storm or a flood event or something else where our farmed landscape could have contributed to reducing that impact, that should be valued into the DEFRA budget. And the DEFRA department has been siloed as a single department for far too long. It needs to spread right across. If we look at all the targets DEFRA has to deliver for nature, for air, for water, for food and everything else, it affects all departments. And we've got to, we're running out of time to make sure that government sees the value in that department across the government and the cost savings it can deliver when invested in well. And that small amounts of money, for every pound you give a farmer to deliver good outcomes, you get £6 to £7 back. Now, I say that's a tremendous value for investment when we look at other areas of the departments. So I am greatly concerned that I don't think government and the nation really values the DEFRA department in all of what it's trying to deliver.
Joe, you were trying to come in. Yeah,
I think just going back to that guerrilla analogy, I think, clearly what we have, my personal opinion from observing what's been happening in the last year is you clearly have a Secretary of State who, farmers often get very angry about why isn't, the Secretary of State, Steve Reed, why isn't he standing up for us? Why isn't he fighting our corner? And I think there's just a fundamental misunderstanding from some people that the more you observe, I don't think the Secretary of State considers his role to be to stand up for essentially the people in industry that he's representing. I think he sees his role as, just being a good soldier for the central party, for the Labour Party. So when the Labour Party is saying, or Treasury is saying, we need budget contributions from you, I think he's saying, and I think this was actually recorded almost as a verbatim quote by The Guardian earlier in the year. Here is my budget. How much of it would you like? And I think that is his priority. That, it seems to be he just wants to essentially ease the general path of government spending in other priority areas rather than fight his corner for DEFRA. And I agree with Martin. What a shame, because there is so much that DEFRA, through the areas of the economy that it oversees, there is so much that it can contribute across government to link up so many different areas of policy which are so essential. And yet here we are essentially, talking about really the termination of 8 slogging long years. And I know Martin and Julia have had much more input into that policy development over the last 8 years. The no doubt millions of hours, the billions of pounds spent to get to this point. And then all of a sudden, one day Treasury turns around and goes, you know what? No, that's all gone. And we're going to do a complete 180. Now, again, there hasn't been an official announcement yet. And yet here we are talking about this. And you know what? It all feels wearily likely that this is where we're going to end up in a few weeks' time.
Julia, we need a gorilla and we seem to have got a rabbit instead. So if not through public funding, how else can government deliver its nature ambitions?
Well, that's a huge challenge. And I think this is where we need to talk about a just transition. And, I've spoken about this a bit earlier. And in the same ways, do we just ask doctors to do more hours because we need to get the nation healthier? Do we ask is that what we're asking farmers to do? Of course, I know you've done a lot of podcasts recently, Finley, on the opportunity for private finance, and in some areas of the uplands that may be possible, and some people are able to access that. But for the farmers I'm working with, commoners, it is really, really difficult to deliver that. We know that common land delivers more benefit society than any other type of land. Over 20% of our sites of special scientific interest are by area is common land, but it only makes up 3% of England. We have over 4,000 commoners managing that land, and it's the friction and the difficulty in delivering in getting public finance in is very hard. I'm involved in a landscape recovery development phase called the Resilient Glendo Mackin, and that's got 3 areas of big areas of common land and 50 farmers. And the Rivers Trust have been working incredibly hard trying to get in private finance, and they expect their overall budget between 2 to 5% will be from private finance, and over 95% will need to come from public finance. So it is very hard. There will be, within the uplands, the other challenge, if you are a site of special scientific interest, and over 50% of common land is, then you can't intensify. So one of the challenges we may well see is more regulation coming in, and as people ratchet up the requirements. And to some extent, yes, the principle of the polluter pays is sensible, but where we're actually asking for active changes, active improvements, then there's a question of, polluter pays, but that's different from active improvement, particularly when people are delivering a lot of benefits that aren't being paid for. So I think we could see a ratcheting up, but we know that regulation is generally unsuccessful. Our government has been very ineffective at enforcement in terms of that. So private finance in my view, is not there yet in order to deliver for the multiple small-scale farmers that there are in the uplands. Regulation is not yet sophisticated enough. Despite there being one public servant within the DEFRA group for every 5 farmers, we now have, so there are 85 farmers. It is extraordinary. If you add up DEFRA core staff, Natural England, Environment Agency, AFA, RPA, there is one public servant for every 5 farmers, and yet we still don't have people on the ground supporting farmers deliver change. The one area where there is some opportunity, and I think every farmer needs to look at this, is their costs. So are they actually farming in the way that's the optimum for their patch of land? So when you look at, there's a lot of work being done, and a book recently out by Chris Clark, the question is what is the optimum stock carrying capacity for your bit of land, whether you're in the lowlands or the uplands? But we know within the uplands, that's a particularly challenging area. We have wonderful grass grown here, but how, the costs of wintering, the costs of finishing, the costs of feeding. So there's some areas that farmers, can look at during this this area of what I call a sort of purgatory that people are in at the moment while they're waiting for new opportunities to unveil. But I think asking poor people to carry the cost for delivering for society as a whole is morally pretty repugnant. And this is something that we shouldn't be within. We know that, and I say when people are earning less than the living wage, we cannot expect them to be delivering. If you look at for holiday makers, I mean, here I am in Ambleside. I don't know how much money is spent on Gore-Tex, on Pertex, on very smart clothing. I mean, literally, I go 20 yards outside my office here at the University of Cumbria, and we have thousands and thousands of pounds spent every day. This is because people love being here in the Lake District. They love the landscape, and it is good. It is good for the nation. And yet we haven't yet got payment. We haven't got charges for coming into our national parks. Is that something where we should be looking at, a congestion charge arrangement? So the burden falls on car drivers rather than those who are poorer coming on buses. I know it's very controversial charging for access to our national parks, but the world is a very different place than it was.
Just quickly, Martin, on that carrot and stick approach, if we are going to be relying more on sticks than carrots, do you think the government's prepared to invest in the enforcement that will be needed to make sure the stick approach works?
They certainly haven't got the enforcement teams they need, and more regulation looks like it's coming and beefed up. But how will they inspect it, regulate it? Under the old payment structure where you're paid per hectare, they had a leverage over you. If you didn't do it, you'd lose in payments. If there's no public funding coming into your business, the leverage is different. But we have tech and AI and satellites and other things. I know they're looking, investing in that kind of side of things. So will it be done more remotely? But someone's going to have to ground truth it. Someone's going to have to come and see it, or just writing you a letter to say it looks like you've done something wrong isn't going to be the way. So who becomes the policeman of the countryside? Or what agency is going to be that coming out to do the checks?
And I wonder if you could just spend a moment thinking about that sort of policy question that Julia was just talking about there, and how farmers can mitigate the risks. The income is being reduced. How can they fill that funding gap themselves? Where do you think their chief opportunities lie?
I think for every business needs to understand its costs and its overheads, and sort of what is the opportunity now and in the future as our weather changes, of getting the right balance to outcomes that isn't going to degrade your soil, it isn't going to bring too many input costs in. And it's for every business to understand that. And many businesses are starting to understand that, trying to find a sweet spot within the landscape you manage, but also trying to optimize those public goods you can deliver and join that in. Well, if you take that out, you're going to have to look at every bit of land and understand its potential and its return on investment, because we are running businesses, and if that return on investment isn't there, choices have to be made. But the trouble is, a lot of farmers have invested in their current business model due to signals and drivers that the government and the market have done, and that means now many businesses have got that weight carrying on them, and they're not having time to adjust. This was meant to be a transition that we could plan through, set out from the government of a transition period that we could change our businesses within. Now, that what we've seen in the last sort of 6 months, some pretty radical announcements from government that changed taxation, changed grants, changed payments, reduce the amount of decoupled payments within a short period. So I planned a business for my own business. We had planned a cash flow that looks very differently now than what we had planned. So we're having to readjust. So farmers have got to get engaged and understand the business. But many of them are so busy in just doing the day job of trying to keep, food on the table and keep the livestock alive. They're not having time to sit down and look at their structure of their business, and it takes a lot of time out and expertise.
We've only got a couple of minutes left, Joe, but I wonder if you could just sort of consider whether you think it's possible to fund an agroecological or regenerative transition without public funding.
I think the issue we've got at the minute is, as we've already noted, this is the private element of the green transition, if you like, is nascent at best. It's incredibly, there's a scattergun approach, a postcode lottery to whether such things are available to you. Julia pointed out Her landscape recovery experience, they're only looking at some 5% of the funds being secured, potentially coming from those green areas. And I think the reason for that is, fundamentally, those green payments are adding costs to the private sector businesses. So for the most part, where they don't have to pay them, why would they? And that just becomes amplified when government, which is supposed to be helping to create these markets, setting the price signals, showing the direction of travel, when government then says, well, we're not going to pay for them, why on earth should the private sector? And then you start to talk to consumers. Oh, well, consumers might have to pay more for their food then if we want more nature-friendly farming. Why should they pay more? Again, if the government's not willing to put its hand into the pocket to essentially come up with the very small amounts of money, fractions of 1% of national expenditure to start to kickstart this market, why should anyone else? So as much as I truly believe that we do need to make this transition, it is difficult to see how it's going to start if that pump priming money is pulled at this very early stage. And of course, we're seeing other things, the undermining of those nature markets, aren't we? Through new regulations coming through, which seems to be essentially undermining things like nutrient neutrality, BNG, before they really even get off the board. So again, there's that sort of chaotic element to policy making. And I think, many housing developers, I've heard stories that, they don't really care that they have to come up with this money and put things like nutrient neutrality into their planning. What they do care about is the goalposts changing every 6 months. And that makes their lives very, very difficult.
Martin, just a last thought from you. We're missing a vision, it seems to me, from both government and from the main farming organisations. As the Chief Executive of the Nature Friendly Farming Network, what do you think the vision should be for food farming and nature?
The vision, one from government, is where's the direction, what do they really value, and what are the priorities from our landscape? Food is always, but there is so much more we can do. And it's for the industry to come out and actually articulate that while, we hear so much about the food part, but that, resilient landscape, flood mitigation, access to nature, and that whole combination, how much fruit, fibre, timber, wool, all that other stuff that comes, energy crops, all that comes from our landscape and comes from our soil. I believe our soil is our bank account for the nation and for our industry. And if we can invest in that and the systems that work with it, we'll have a thriving rural economy and a nation. So we need the government to step up. We need our department secretaries of state to step up and set out a clear journey for us to get invested in. But we also need our industry to set out the value of everything we can produce from our landscape.
The soil is the bank account for our nation. That's a great point on which to end. Thanks so much, everyone. It's been as interesting as it has been worrying, frankly. I'd like to thank my guests, Julia Aglionby, Joe Stanley and Martin Lyons. Just a reminder that full series of Farm Gates, Filling the Funding Gap, which is sadly now more relevant than ever, is available if you just scroll back in your podcast feed. If you've enjoyed listening, please come back, listen to more, tell your friends, like us, review us and share our links. Farmgate is part of 8.9.com, the land use news channel, which is sponsored by First Milk, Pelican Ag, Rural Solutions, the Usk Catchment Partnership, Agrolo, and by individual donors. I've been Finley Costain. Bye for now.